Hello there, my friend, and welcome to another journey through the pages of history. Come with me, and I will guide you through another fascinating part of our seemingly endless past. Tonight, we travel back to the times of ancient Egyptian pyramids, not to behold their magnificence, but to understand those who spent their lives building them. You know the pyramids as ancient wonders, colossal tombs built for kings. But what if I told you they were also monuments to terrible suffering? Beneath every block of stone lies the story of a man who bled, broke, and was forgotten. No slaves, no machines, just tens of thousands of Egyptians pushing themselves to the edge for a pharaoh who would never even know their names. This is their story, told through the eyes of one of them, the brutal hidden life of pyramid builders of Egypt. This is the story of Setkar. He was not a great man. He was not a priest, nobleman, or warrior. He was a conscripted builder. His story represents the thousands who stood behind the tools but were never written into the scrolls. Through his eyes, we will see not just how the pyramid was built, but what it truly cost. The Great Pyramid of Giza rises from the Egyptian sands like a mountain built by the hands of gods. Over 140 meters tall when first completed, it remained the tallest man-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. Today it's seen as one of the last surviving wonders of the ancient world, a monument to Pharaoh Khufu's divine power, eternal afterlife, and unimaginable ambition. But beneath the gleaming white casing stones that once covered its face lies a darker story, one of suffering, endurance and human sacrifice, not in the sense of ritual altars and blood rites, but in the daily grind of muscle, sweat and quiet death. The pyramid was not built by slaves in chains, as early Western myth once claimed, nor was it a labour of love, as some romanticize. The truth lies somewhere in between, in the brutal and complex world of ancient Egyptian labour. Recent archaeological discoveries, including the workers' village at Hayt el Ghurab, tombs of labour supervisors and preserved tools, have transformed our understanding of how this colossal monument was made. We now know that tens of thousands of workers were conscripted to work for months or years at a time, often during the annual Nile flood, when fields were submerged and farming paused. These men came from across the kingdom, pulled from their homes by duty, tax, or force. They lived in regimented camps, ate bread and drank beer 3 times a day, and laboured under the punishing desert heat. They weren't slaves, but they weren't free either. They built not just for Pharaoh's glory, but to survive, to protect their families, or to avoid punishment. They carried blocks weighing over 2 tons on sledges across specially built roads, dragged them up earthen ramps, and aligned them with astonishing precision. Accidents were common, bones were broken, some never returned home. And though Egypt's elite recorded the names of kings, priests and architects in hieroglyphs, the names of the builders were rarely preserved, lost to time. This is not a tale of gods and gold, but of blistering hands, broken backs, quiet resistance, and enduring human spirit. This is the brutal life of Egypt's pyramid builders. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a like, subscribe, or maybe comment on where you are listening from. Now sit back, relax, get comfy, and we will begin our journey. In the fertile stretch of southern Egypt where the Nile's floodwaters spilled across the land and turned arid dust into black rich silt, a boy named Setkar stood on the threshold of a life not of his choosing. At 17 he had spent his years as most did in the village of Menat, working the land alongside his father, feeding goats, hauling water from the canal, and marking seasons by the rhythm of the river. But this year, the river brought more than grain and mud. It brought men from the north, emissaries of Pharaoh Khufu, who came not for tribute in barley or cattle, but for bodies. Each year when the Nile overflowed and made farming impossible, the royal administration activated its Korva labour system, a centuries-old practice where ordinary Egyptians were conscripted to serve the state for a portion of the year. The building of monuments, temples, roads and royal tombs depended on it. When Khufu ordered the construction of his pyramid at Giza, the largest stone monument in history, the scale of that need became unprecedented. Setkar's village, like many others across Upper Egypt, was ordered to provide men for the project. Royal scribes arrived by river, accompanied by soldiers and tax officials. They unrolled linen scrolls, read names aloud, and made selections based on strength, age, and family contribution. Refusal was not an option. Compliance was a matter of law and survival. Setkar was chosen without ceremony. His family, like many, understood what was required. Tools were handed over. Bread and beer were packed. Small protective amulets were tied around the neck. Then the young men of Menat joined others from the region, forming a caravan that would march north alongside the Nile towards the rising pyramid at Giza. The journey lasted nearly 2 weeks. The conscripts followed the river's curve, occasionally boarding state-run barges or hauling carts across land where the waterway narrowed. As the caravan moved northward, the southern accent of Upper Egypt merged with the sharper dialects of the delta. Men spoke of their homes, their temples and their fears, though few could say what truly awaited them at the construction site. The approach to Giza marked a stark shift in the landscape. Beyond the cultivated fields and date palm groves, the edge of the desert rose abruptly into the plateau. There, the pyramid loomed. At the time of Setkar's arrival, the Great Pyramid was perhaps halfway complete, already dwarfing the surrounding temples, quarries and labour camps. Built from over 2 million limestone blocks, some weighing more than 2 tons each, it rose layer by layer into the sky, an artificial mountain dedicated to the divine kingship of Khufu. But it was not the pyramid itself that first overwhelmed newcomers. It was the scale of the operation behind it. South of the pyramid base sprawled a massive labour settlement. A planned, state-organised complex designed to house, feed and manage tens of thousands of workers. Later generations of archaeologists would call it Hayt el Ghurab, the lost city of the pyramid builders. In Setkar's time, it was simply the workers' city, a bustling grid of barracks, bakeries, storage silos, kitchens, stables and workshops. The city functioned with military precision. Workers were registered, assigned to crews, issued tools and inspected for health. Those with useful skills, stonecutters, metalworkers, carpenters, were marked for specialised labour. Others, like Setkar, were placed into hauler gangs, tasked with transporting limestone blocks from the quarries to the ramps that ascended the pyramid's face. The workforce was arranged in units of increasing scale, crews of around 40 men, organised into gangs of 200, and then into larger divisions known as files. Each team had a name, often patriotic or mythological, such as the Followers of Khufu or the Strong Arms of Horus. Leadership flowed downward from elite overseers appointed by royal decree to foremen promoted from among the labourers themselves. Setkar's new home was a mud brick barracks on the southern end of the workers' city. His group shared a long rectangular hall divided by sleeping mats and stacked tools. Ventilation holes in the walls allowed for airflow but did little to ease the heat. The smell of sweat, dust and firewood lingered day and night. Rations were consistent but plain. Each man received a daily allotment of bread, beer, onions and sometimes dried fish or pulses. The bread was heavy and slightly gritty from the stone ground flour, while the beer was thick and unfiltered, brewed from emmer wheat. These meals were calculated to maintain energy levels for intense physical labour. Nutrition, while basic, was taken seriously by the state. Workers were valuable and expensive to replace. On the first morning, Setkar joined his crew for orientation. Overseers demonstrated the process of stone hauling using sledges, wooden runners soaked in water to reduce friction, and thick hemp ropes. Teams were shown how to coordinate their movements with rhythmic chants, ensuring synchronized pulls that reduced strain and prevented injury. Discipline was rigid. Overseers carried staffs and leather whips, and any sign of disobedience or weakness could result in punishment. Some were struck, others were reassigned to latrine pits or garbage duty. There were whispers of those sent to penal quarries in the eastern desert where survival was uncertain. Within days, Setkar began hauling stone. The blocks arrived from the Tura limestone quarries, transported by boat and dragged up ramps to the appropriate layer of the pyramid. The ramps themselves were feats of engineering, massive causeways of mud brick, limestone chips and wooden planks that snaked up the pyramid's sides. Hauling crews were stationed along these routes in shifts, pushing, pulling and guiding the sledges up the incline under the watchful eye of foremen. The labour was relentless. Under the heat of the midday sun, bodies strained and feet blistered. Injuries were common. Pulled muscles, rope burns, crushed fingers. The dead were quietly removed. Sometimes buried in modest graves near the site, sometimes carted away without ceremony. For most, the only markers were broken bones buried in sand. But the machine did not stop. Each day, more blocks arrived. More teams rotated in. The rhythm of the pyramid continued, an unyielding cycle of stone, sweat and silence. By the end of the first week, Setkar had become one of them. He was no longer a farmer's son or a boy from Menat. He was a hauler of Pharaoh's stone, a living component in Egypt's most ambitious construction. In the shadow of the rising pyramid, his identity dissolved into the collective. His name would not be recorded, his story would not be told, but his body, like those of thousands around him, was etched into the limestone, pressed into the mortar between blocks, sealed into the very core of Khufu's immortality. The sun on the Giza plateau rose like fire behind the skeletal frame of the unfinished pyramid. Its first rays struck the limestone blocks with blinding force, turning the desert into a field of white flame. On that morning, Setkar joined his work gang in a tightly packed line, standing shoulder to shoulder with men from all corners of the kingdom. Fishermen from the Fayum, goat herders from the eastern desert, and sons of blacksmiths from the delta marshes. The day began with the sounding of the overseer's trumpet, a deep echoing note that signalled the start of the labour shift. The workers' city, organised with state precision, erupted into motion. From the communal dormitories, men poured into the central square where assignments were handed out. Each man reported to a scribe seated behind a reed table, where tallies were kept and progress recorded on limestone tablets or rolled paper. A missed shift meant deduction of rations, or worse, physical punishment. Setkar's assignment remained unchanged, stone hauling along the southeastern ramp. His crew had been assigned a block recently ferried from the Tura quarries east of the Nile, a bright white limestone slab measuring nearly 1.5 metres long and weighing over 2 tons. It was a relatively small block by pyramid standards, yet still required the full strength of 20 men to move it. Ropes made of braided papyrus fibre were slung over their shoulders, rough against sun-scorched skin. The sledge rested on pre-wetted track of limestone chips and clay, soaked repeatedly to reduce drag. An overseer shouted the cadence, clapping his hands or banging a stick on the sledge frame. The men heaved in rhythm, their legs straining against the sand-caked earth, sandals slipping in the mud. As they moved, clouds of dust rose into the air, choking lungs and blinding eyes. By midday, the crew had advanced just 50 metres. Setkar soon realised that hauling stone was not the most dangerous task. It was steering the sledge around tight corners of the ramp or up the steeper inclines where misjudgment could be fatal. The pyramid's lower levels were accessible by wide sloped causeways, but the higher stages required narrower paths and temporary switchback ramps that bent at precarious angles. One afternoon, another crew was manoeuvring a block up a higher tier using logs as rollers when one dislodged. The entire sledge tilted. A man at the front, a young hauler, barely older than Setkar, was pinned beneath the stone. His scream was short. The crew was forced to abandon the block. The body was pulled away and covered with a mat. The name of the dead man was never spoken again. Accidents were not uncommon, nor were beatings. Discipline at the pyramid site was absolute. Overseers, many of whom had served in the army, were authorized to punish infractions on the spot. Deliberate disobedience, dropping tools, speaking out of turn, or slowing the pace could result in lashes across the back, or confinement in the punishment pits. Small holding cells carved from bedrock near the southeastern edge of the labour site. Punishments were not merely for the sake of cruelty, they served a larger purpose. Maintaining order in a workforce that exceeded 10,000 active labourers during peak months, the state could not afford disruption. Progress was measured in cubits and deadlines in lunar cycles. Khufu's reign would not last forever. The pyramid had to be completed before his death to ensure his divine rebirth. Despite the conditions, many workers remained compliant, not out of fear alone, but out of obligation. Participation in state labour, though compulsory, was seen by some as a form of patriotic service. It was a tax on time rather than on coin, and it allowed villages to maintain favour with the royal administration. Labourers often rotated back home after a few months of service, where they received small grain payments or exemptions for their families. Setkar's rotation had not yet been scheduled. Like many newcomers, he had been assigned to a longer stint, 6 months or more. These long haulers formed the backbone of the operation. Their lives revolved entirely around the work site, with only occasional rest days permitted during major religious festivals. Work was governed by strict cycles. The morning shift began at sunrise and continued until the sun reached its highest point. A short rest followed, often spent under makeshift awnings or mud brick shelters. Bread and beer were distributed again at midday. The second shift lasted until twilight. At night, the ramp platforms glowed with the soft light of oil lamps, their flickering shadows dancing across stone. Though the pyramid was not worked after dark, the workshops and kitchens remained active. Bakers began preparation for the next day's loaves. Metalworkers resharpened copper tools, and scribes reviewed tallies by lamplight. Setkar, like many haulers, used the evening to soak his feet in shallow basins of water, clean his garments and tend to cracked skin. Cuts were rubbed with animal fat and wrapped in linen. Some men fashioned crude sandals from discarded ropes and palm fibres to protect their soles from the chipped limestone paths. Despite the exhaustion, there were few signs of disorder. The camp was kept meticulously clean. Waste was buried or burned. Injuries were reported to healers, many of whom employed salves made from frankincense, myrrh or garlic. The work was punishing, but the infrastructure supporting it was advanced. In time, Setkar began to distinguish the rhythm of day, the unspoken codes between men, and the hierarchy that defined life on the plateau. Stonecutters held respect. Toolmakers were watched carefully. Haulers were expected to work silently. But above all, the foremen, mid-level supervisors who reported directly to elite overseers, controlled everything. A word from one of them could grant extra food, temporary reassignment, or condemnation to pit duty. It was a world of silent calculation and enduring hardship, but within its order was purpose. Even among the most brutal aspect of the project there was a shared understanding. They were building something no one else on Earth could match. As the ramp climbed higher and the stone blocks inched towards their final position, the pyramid grew steadily under the weight of tens of thousands of hands. Setkar's hands became blistered, then calloused. His body hardened by repetition. His back bent into the shape of his work. He had become part of a living machine, one driven not by divine will, but by the disciplined force of human labour. The harsh march to Giza did not end with the caravan. It continued every day on the ramp, step by agonizing step. At the foot of the Giza plateau south of the pyramid itself sprawled one of the most advanced labour settlements of the ancient world. Built not for ceremony but for function, it served as the operational heart of Pharaoh Khufu's monumental construction effort. It was here that Setkar lived, ate and recovered each night, in the organised dust and mud brick of what would later be called the Builder's City. The city had no temples, no statues and no tombs. It was not meant to endure, yet it operated with the complexity of a royal estate. Excavations centuries later would reveal the hidden sophistication of the site. Narrow streets aligned in a grid, massive bakeries, sprawling storehouses, copper tool workshops, butchers' yards, and long dormitory barracks housing thousands of workers. For those who laboured on the pyramid, this was the world behind the stones. Setkar's barracks sat in a row with dozens of others. Each structure was constructed from sun-dried mud brick with low walls and narrow doorways to limit exposure to wind and dust. Inside, the men slept shoulder to shoulder on straw mats laid across the hard floor. The barracks were divided not by privacy but by rank. Foremen and senior workers claimed the spaces near the entrances where ventilation was better. Younger and newer labourers, including Setkar, were pushed towards the rear. Food, supplies and resources were distributed according to status. A hauler like Setkar received a daily allowance of bread, beer and onions, along with occasional portions of salted fish or pulses. Skilled artisans such as masons and coppersmiths received larger portions, and in rare cases even cuts of meat. Foremen were entitled to honey, dates and extra garments. Central to the city's operation were its industrial bakeries and breweries, among the largest of their kind in the ancient world. The bread ovens operated in long rows, tended primarily by women and boys. Dough was kneaded by foot in large clay troughs and baked in conical moulds sealed with mud. Each day thousands of flat loaves were produced, packed into baskets and distributed across the site. The beer was thick and nutritious, brewed in ceramic vats using emmer wheat, barley and water. Date syrup or carob pods were often added for sweetness. It was less a beverage than a meal in liquid form, and it provided hydration, calories, and fermentation-based sterilisation that made it safer than Nile water. The organisation extended to hygiene. Waste pits were dug at the edge of the city and lined with limestone. Workers rotated through latrine duty. Trash was buried or burned. Medical tents, simple open-aired huts, were staffed by temple-trained healers who treated injuries using honey, garlic paste and linen bandages. Though primitive by modern standards, Egyptian medicine was advanced for its time. Setkar had seen several workers recover from infections and bone fractures under their care. Social life within the workers' city followed an informal rhythm. In the evening, after work had ended and the dust settled, small gatherings would form near the barracks. Some men played reed flutes or beat rhythms on upturned baskets. Others carved animal figures or amulets from bone and wood. Stories were shared, though few had the strength for laughter after a full day on the ramp. Disputes were resolved quickly. The foremen held both administrative and judicial power, and their word was final. Theft of food or tools could result in reduced rations or reassignment to refuse pits. Fights between workers were punished by whipping or confinement. Nonetheless, some camaraderie developed among crews, particularly those who laboured together under the harshest conditions. Setkar's own crew was composed of men from various parts of the kingdom, Upper Egyptians from the valley, Nubians from the south, and even a few foreigners from border provinces. Language varied, but necessity created its own dialect of shouts, signals, and chants. Cooperation was not optional. During rest days, which coincided with state festivals or religious observances, workers were permitted limited movement around the settlement. On such days, Setkar observed the city in ways he could not during labour. Workshops lined the roads, where copper chisels were hammered, wooden sledges repaired, and ropes twisted from palm fibre and flax. At the northern edge, foremen and scribes lived in more permanent structures, complete with plastered walls and storage rooms. These buildings included administration offices where deliveries of stone were logged, rations tallied, and progress reports compiled and sealed with royal insignia. From here, the state monitored the entire project, ensuring that the thousands of men at Giza moved in step with the demands of Khufu's vision. Though it lacked temples, the city was not devoid of ritual. Small household shrines were built into the walls of the barracks where clay figures of gods were kept. Offerings of grains, incense, or water were sometimes left. Amulets were worn by most men, tucked under garments or tied to tools. There were not formal priestly rites, but personal gestures, attempts to win protection in a place where danger was constant. Some workers, particularly the older ones, spoke of the soul's journey, the belief that those who served Pharaoh in life would be rewarded in the afterlife. Whether it was sincere or survival-based, such beliefs gave meaning to a life defined by repetition and physical suffering. Setkar's days began and ended in this tightly controlled world. The work was brutal, but the organisation that sustained it was extraordinary. Food arrived on time, tools were maintained, scribes recorded everything. There was no luxury in the builder's city, but there was order, and that order allowed the pyramid to rise. Beneath the chaos of labour, a hidden civilization functioned, a city that breathed stone, consumed sweat, and dreamed of eternity. The Giza plateau was never quiet. Even at dawn, when the first light touched the rising edges of Khufu's pyramid, the site trembled with motion. Voices echoed across the stone face, sledges groaned under the weight of limestone. Hammers struck chisels in a constant rhythm. For those conscripted into the project, each day was a repetition of the last. A cycle of labour so precise it mirrored the workings of a machine. For Setkar and the thousands like him, the day began before the sun had cleared the horizon. The deep horn blew from the supervisor's platform. It signalled the start of the shift. From the barracks, men filled out with water jars, head coverings and worn sandals. Their path led them through the workers' city and up towards the base of the pyramid, where they waited to be assigned a sledge or a rope team. The air at this hour was cool, but it did not remain so for long. By mid-morning the sun struck the plateau with relentless force. The reflective limestone turned the pyramid face into a white furnace. Temperatures near the ramps routinely exceeded 38 degrees Celsius, intensified by the exertion of the labourers. Setkar's assigned role remained within the hauler crews. His team was responsible for transporting limestone blocks up the lower ramp to the middle tiers of the pyramid. The blocks, quarried locally from Giza and occasionally brought across the river from Tura, were hewn into rectangular forms and placed atop sledges. Each sledge was dragged over compacted limestone and clay tracks, which were regularly doused with water to reduce the friction. Each block required a coordinated effort of at least 20 men. Ropes were looped around the stone and pulled across chests or shoulders depending on the terrain. The team moved in rhythm, guided by a foreman whose chants instructed. This chanting, recorded in tomb paintings and supported by linguistic studies, was essential. It synchronized movement and prevented uneven strain. A single misstep could send the entire team tumbling. Rest came only when the sledge reached the designated layer, where stonemasons awaited with tools to begin final adjustments. Each placement was checked by senior architects with measuring rods and plumb bobs, ensuring that the angles and alignments remained within royal specification. Precision was non-negotiable. Even the slightest irregularity in block positioning could compromise the stability of the structure. Evidence of these tools, copper plumbs, levelling cords and measuring sticks, have been found in nearby workshops, confirming the intense scrutiny under which the builders laboured. Once the block was installed, the hauling crew descended again, and the process repeated. Over the course of a day, a single crew might move 2 or 3 blocks, sometimes fewer depending on the slope, the weather, or the number of accidents. On days when hauling was paused due to block shortages or quarry delays, crews were reassigned to gravel clearing or ramp maintenance, tasks no less grueling. Limestone dust filled the air continuously, coating everything. It settled into hair, eyes, nostrils, and food. Workers developed persistent coughs, eye infections, and cracked skin. Cuts from rope burns or sharp limestone edges often became infected if not treated properly. Healers offered their salves and crushed herbs. They applied them with strips of linen, but severe injuries frequently meant reassignment to menial labour or permanent removal from the crew. Despite the dangers, the workforce functioned with near-military discipline. Overseers moved between crews carrying rods or flails. Punishment for dereliction, fighting or disobedience was swift. Minor offences were met with whippings. More serious ones resulted in reduced rations or confinement. Extreme cases were sent to the penal quarries, remote rock pits in the desert where survival rates were low. Setkar's crew, like many others, operated under constant pressure. Efficiency was tracked by scribes who recorded block movements on clay tablets. These records were compiled daily and submitted to higher officials. Performance could lead to rewards, extra food, better lodging, or fewer night duties, but failure carried consequences. To manage the scale of work, the site was divided into zones, each with its own crews, overseers and logistical teams. The southern ramp handled most of the white casing stones from Tura, while the northern ramp, narrower and more difficult to manoeuvre, was reserved for smaller interior blocks. Intermediate levels were accessed by zigzagging ramps built temporarily against the structure and later dismantled or absorbed into the pyramid as construction advanced. Throughout the site, hundreds of copper chisels were in constant use. Stonecutters relied on these tools to shape blocks to fit precisely within tight gaps. Since copper dulled quickly, large quantities of tools were required, and a dedicated crew of metal workers laboured day and night to reforge and sharpen them. Their furnaces, located near the base of the plateau, were fueled by charcoal transported into baskets from the delta forests, another layer in the immense logistical chain supporting the pyramid. Food and water distribution followed strict timetables. Midday breaks allowed labourers to retreat under shaded awnings or within the shelter of half-walled huts. Meals consisted of additional bread, salted radish or garlic, and thicker beer, enough to sustain, never to satisfy. Some carried small tokens or charms believed to protect them from fatigue and injury, invoking deities such as Bez, protector of households and workers. Amid this grueling routine, moments of humanity surfaced. Workers developed silent cooperation within their crews, coordinating gestures and developing their own methods to reduce strain. Some shared sandals, others helped adjust rope tensions or distribute load. Older workers advised younger ones on how to pace their energy and avoid critical injury. But the system allowed little space for sentiment. Death was a constant feature of the work. Collapsed ramps, falling stones, and exhaustion claimed lives regularly. When a labourer died, the body was often buried in a simple grave on the outskirts of the plateau, marked with only a stone or piece of pottery. In some cases, if the deceased was a respected craftsman or foreman, a small offering or stela was placed nearby. Most, however, were simply replaced. The work did not stop. Day after day, the sun rose above the Giza plateau to find its workforce in motion. Thousands of men dragging stone under the watch of gods and kings. In the shadow of the pyramid, time was conquered by discipline. The monument that would outlast empires was being carved not just from stone, but from flesh and endurance. Order on the Giza Plateau was not sustained by cooperation alone. It was enforced firmly, visibly, and without apology. In a workforce exceeding 10,000 men during peak season, composed of farmers, craftsmen, herders, and conscripts drawn from every corner of the kingdom, discipline was not merely a tool, it was the backbone of construction. Setkar had seen the lash used within days of his arrival. A young labourer in a neighbouring crew, exhausted from 3 back-to-back shifts, had collapsed while hauling a block. The foreman did not speak. He simply raised his hand. 2 assistant overseers stepped forward, dragged the man to the edge of the ramp, and lashed him across the back. This message was not lost on the watching crew. In ancient Egypt, public punishment was not random violence. It was part of a structured system of labour control used across royal estates, quarries, and temple workshops. Hierarchies were clearly established. At the top stood the chief architects and royal officials, often appointed directly by the Pharaoh's court. Below them were the overseers and foremen, many of whom were experienced craftsmen elevated to positions of authority. Then came the workers, organised into crews of various skill levels. The overseers on the pyramid site held broad disciplinary powers. With no time for individual trials or appeals, punishment was carried out on the spot. Offences ranged from legitimate, such as fighting, theft or damaging tools, to arbitrary, including sluggish movement, careless stacking of stone, or speaking out of turn. Infractions were noted by scribes, whose presence at nearly every major station ensured that records were kept even as whips cracked. Most common were flogging and food reduction. A man who underperformed or broke a rule could find his rations cut in half for a day or more. In a labour environment where calories were survival, the punishment was feared almost as much as the whip. Public floggings, though brutal, were also ritualised. The lash was delivered in front of the workers' crew, ensuring a shared memory and group reinforcement of obedience. For more serious offences, attempted escape, assaulting an overseer, or sabotage, punishments escalated. The most feared were confinement and reassignment. The punishment pits, carved into bedrock at the edge of the worksite, served as temporary holding cells. Prisoners were locked without tools or food for up to 48 hours. In summer, the heat could kill. In winter, exposure chilled the body beyond endurance. Setkar once passed these pits during a rest shift. He saw 4 men sitting in silence behind reed-wrapped stakes, their backs bloody, their feet swollen. No guards stood nearby. No one tried to escape. There was nowhere to run. Reassignment was another form of discipline. A man who failed in one crew could be sent to latrine maintenance, refuse pits or gravel clearing, the most despised duties on the site. These jobs were physically demeaning, marked by filth, odour and isolation. Though less visibly violent than the lash, reassignment served as a psychological punishment, separating the labourer from his team and from the pride of contribution. Despite the brutality the system functioned, Egypt's ancient state bureaucracy was highly organised, and even within the punishment hierarchy there were standards. Overseers were themselves accountable to scribes and inspectors. Whippings that resulted in permanent injury were recorded, and if found to be unjustified, could result in demotion or reassignment of the overseer, though such consequences were rare and generally reserved for abuse that threatened overall productivity. Some level of resistance did exist among the workers, but it was subtle and cautious. Tools might be deliberately dulled, work slowed in extreme heat, messages carved into discarded limestone fragments or whispered amongst crews voiced discontent. These small acts of defiance rarely halted production, however. but they served as release valves in a world of constant supervision. Despite the hard discipline, not all overseers were cruel. A few earned grudging respect by protecting their crews from overwork, shielding injured men from excessive punishment, or negotiating minor schedule shifts to accommodate illness or injury. These individuals maintained a careful balance, enforcing the law while preserving the human core of their crews. Among workers, their names were passed quietly and often remembered long after the pyramid was complete. Setkar's own crew was overseen by a man known as Bakuna, a wiry, sharp-eyed veteran who had worked on previous royal tombs near Setkar. Unlike others, Bakuna barely used his flail. Instead, he enforced order with silence and expectation. Mistakes were met with stares, not screams, yet his presence created tension. Men worked harder when he was nearby, not out of fear of violence, but fear of dismissal. He demanded competence and he rewarded it. Punishment did not only take physical form, however. Shaming rituals were also employed. A man who repeatedly failed might be forced to walk barefoot through the workers' city with a broken tool around his neck, a sign of failure. Others were required to clean the barracks of more senior crews or perform menial tasks under mocking chants. In a society that valued public image and reputation, such shame could be as damaging as injury. What endured most in the minds of the labourer, however, was the weight of constant surveillance. Scribes, overseers and royal inspectors monitored every corner of the pyramid site. Tally sheets were filed daily. Stone movements, crew performances and rations were recorded. The pyramid was not rising by chance. It was being built under a system designed to remove uncertainty, to strip away improvisation and to enforce divine precision. Even in sleep, the workers remained under control. Night rotations patrolled the workers' city. Barrack doors were checked. Loud speech or gatherings after dark were forbidden. The guards were fewer than during the day, but they were armed, and they had orders. For many like Setkar, the hardest punishment was not the whip, but the absence of autonomy. Each day, every hour, every movement was regulated. Meals were assigned, tasks were measured, voices were silenced, and yet the pyramid rose. Stone by stone it climbed the desert sky, fed by the structures beneath it, not just of ramps and rope, but of discipline, sacrifice and fear. Behind the gleaming facade that would one day impress foreign kings and future scholars stood the unacclaimed system that made it possible. The lash, the pit, the tally board. And beneath it all, the human cost. Beneath the deafening noise of moving stone, another sound echoed across the Giza plateau. The rhythmic strikes of copper on limestone, chisel against block. It was quieter than the shouting of haulers or the thud of sledge tracks, but no less constant. It belonged to the masons, the craftsmen who shaped raw stone into the architecture of eternity. Setkar first encountered their world when his crew was reassigned for several days to help clear rubble around the stonecutter's yard. Injuries among haulers had temporarily reduced crew size, and the foreman had diverted labourers to less dangerous but equally demanding work near the masonry workshops. There he observed a different rhythm of labour, one not built on brute strength, but on focus, control and precision. The masons worked under canvas awnings stretched between wooden posts to shield their eyes from the sun's glare. The stone blocks were laid out in long rows, each one marked with red ochre guidelines drawn by foremen. Using copper chisels, dolerite hammers and flat bronze blades, the stonecutters shaped each block to exact dimensions. Each cut was made with deliberation. A misplaced strike could shatter the block and waste days of labour. These men were not chosen at random. They were among the most skilled workers in Egypt, trained in temples, workshops and royal quarries. Many had inherited their craft through family lines, learning from fathers and uncles. They bore calloused fingers and dust-filled lungs, but their hands moved with grace. Their discipline came not from overseers' threats, but from pride in precision. Unlike the haulers and general labourers, masons lived in slightly elevated quarters. Their barracks were cleaner, positioned closer to the tool stores, and protected from the worst desert winds. Their rations were larger and sometimes included oil or vegetables, small recognitions of their status. Within the mason's yard, another form of coordination unfolded: the chant of the stonecutters. It was not music in the modern sense, but a method of regulating the tempo of work. A foreman or senior mason would chant in slow, rhythmic syllables, marking the pattern of strikes and the intervals of tool switching. Each crew of 3 to 5 men would echo the rhythm with hammer blows, keeping a collective pace. Inscriptions from later periods suggest that this practice extended across many building sites, ensuring that workers remained synchronized and tools wore evenly. The stonecutters carved not just blocks, but also the architectural features of the pyramid: sloped casing stones, corner joints and inner passageways. Their most important task was shaping the Tura limestone casing stones, the gleaming outer shell of the pyramid, known for its fine grain and dazzling brightness when polished. These blocks were delivered from the eastern quarries by boat, then transported to the pyramid's base and lifted into place. Cut to almost seamless accuracy, the casing stones were laid with joints less than 0.5 millimetre wide, a feat requiring such careful craftsmanship that later visitors, including classical Greek historians, would marvel at their precision. The masons who worked on these stones were subject to even higher scrutiny. Their cuts were inspected by royal architects whose judgments were final. Setkar's work in the area gave him insight into the inner workings of these crews. He noticed how they maintained their tools, heating and hammering copper chisels until the edge was sharp, cooling them in water, then testing them against rough stone. Every tool was numbered and logged. Each mason had a set signed out at the beginning of the day, and scribes tallied returns in the evening. Loss of a tool could result in punishment or replacement duty. Though their lives were easier in some respects, the masons faced pressure of a different kind: the demand for perfection. A poorly fitted block might not cause injury like a dropped sledge, but it could slow the entire project. Delays in laying casing stones postponed final polishing and increased the risk of rain damage to the layers below. Errors were not merely corrected, they were remembered. In one case, a stonemason misjudged the angle of a sloped corner block. The discrepancy was discovered by the architect during final inspection. The stone was removed and discarded. The mason was stripped of his crew position and reassigned to hauling duties for a full moon cycle, a humiliating demotion among craftsmen. Yet pride endured. Within the cutting yards, some workers inscribed their names discreetly onto unused stone offcuts, alongside miniature depictions of tools or symbols of deities. These marks, likely intended as personal signatures or invocations of protection, have been found by archaeologists centuries later, testaments to the individuality hidden within a collective effort. The masons also received visitors from the pharaoh's inner circle more frequently than the haulers. Royal inspectors occasionally toured the cutting yards, examining progress, reviewing alignment and inspecting critical elements of the pyramid's design. Their presence inspired both fear and motivation. These were men close to the court, individuals who reported directly to the king and could determine the fate of a craftsman's career. Despite their elevated status, masons were not immune to injury or exhaustion. The constant striking of stone caused joint damage and muscular strain. Dust inhalation led to chronic respiratory problems. Accidents with hammers or slipped blades could sever tendons. When injured, they were treated by the same medical teams who cared for the haulers. What distinguished the masons was their legacy. Long after the last block was laid and the casing stones polished to a mirror finish, their work remained visible. Unlike the haulers whose strength faded into the foundation, the masons left behind lines and angles that defined erosion and time. And yet, like the rest of the workforce, few of their names survived in official records. The stonecutters' songs faded with the wind, but their hands carved the face of immortality. The pyramid would shine for millennia, not just as a tomb, but as the silent testimony of men who shaped stone to serve a god-king. Amid the stone, dust and discipline of Giza, a kind of brotherhood emerged, not formed through freedom, but formed in hardship, in the workers' city and on the pyramid itself. Men bound by labour and survival created bonds that neither rank nor punishment could easily sever. These unrecorded relationships gave meaning to the drudgery and in many cases made it endurable. Setkar's crew, known formerly on the tally rolls as the Southern Haulers of Ramp 9, consisted of 37 men during the season of Shimu, the dry harvest period. Drawn from villages scattered across Upper Egypt, few had known one another before conscription. Yet after weeks of hauling stone together under the desert sun, they moved as a unit. Crew cohesion was no accident. The state depended on it. Each team had to function with the coordination of a machine, especially when manoeuvring multi-ton blocks up ramps. Unity was enforced through shared risk. A sledge pulled unevenly could slide or tip. A rope handled carelessly could snap. In either case, death could result, not for one man, but for many. But the bonds formed among crews extended beyond work. In the barracks where men slept side by side, a kind of communal life developed. Responsibilities were informally shared. One worker might patch worn sandals with twine, while another boiled water for bandages. Someone else carved a small figure of Bez, the dwarf god of protection, and placed it in the corner of their sleeping chamber. It was not the religion that sustained them, though. It was the ritual. Every night, one crew member recited a spoken formula, a protective invocation directed not toward Pharaoh, but toward the gods of survival. These invocations, though not officially sanctioned, were tolerated. They were part of the invisible framework that helped the workforce endure. Later generations of archaeologists would uncover traces of these prayers scratched into walls and storage pots, evidence of beliefs that lived outside of state doctrine. Shared food became another pillar of cohesion. Though rations were distributed individually, it was common practice to pool resources within a barracks. Workers with stronger stomachs took the toughest bread. Those recovering from injuries were offered the better cuts of dried fish or dates saved from the midday meal. On rest days, small caches of honey, onions or fermented cheese might be shared, sometimes stolen from storehouses or bartered from kitchen workers in exchange for labour or gossip. Social distinctions still existed. Masons and scribes rarely interacted with haulers. Their barracks were physically separated and their rations superior, but among the haulers bonds often crossed village or religious order. Men from Nubia, Aswan, Memphis and Abydos worked together with minimal conflict. Dialects differed, but communication adapted. Simple hand signals, shared chants and physical cues became the grammar of labour. Music and rhyme also served a unifying role. Work chants kept crews in sync, but they also provided emotional rhythm. Short songs, often improvised, accompanied hauling and tool transport. Some used phrases drawn from temple hymns. Others referenced animals, seasons or famous flood years. None were written down, but they passed from crew to crew, echoing across the ramp stones. In the rare stillness of evening, some crews sang softly, not work chants, but laments. These songs memorialised those who had died on the ramp, men's names who were never carved in stone or listed in royal scrolls. A common refrain referenced the man beneath the block, a phrase understood by every worker without explanation. Setkar's crew carried its own scars. One member, a former field hand named Nefru, had lost 3 fingers to a sledge mishap. Rather than expel him, the crew assigned him to rope management and stone wetting, tasks requiring dexterity but not grip. Another, a tall Nubian named Hanu, had twice taken lashes in place of a younger man unaccustomed to the pace of the ramps. These acts, unofficial and undocumented, reflected an unwritten code of conduct amongst labourers. Occasionally, disputes did erupt. Fights over stolen food or tool damage were not uncommon. When serious, 4 men intervened. In lesser cases, crews handled their own discipline, usually through temporary exclusion or enforced silence. An individual cut off from shared food and conversation would quickly return to cooperative behaviour. In this world, isolation was a punishment nearly as severe as pain. Beyond daily work, the brotherhoods extended into informal networks of mutual protection. When men fell ill, others brought water. When someone collapsed on the ramp, their team did not simply step over them, they carried them back. Not out of sentiment, but out of recognition. What happens to one can happen to all. In some crews, symbolic tokens were adopted. Small carvings, painted stones, or knotted cords tied to ropes. These were not official emblems, but served as crew markers, symbols of identity within the faceless ranks. One team carried a piece of worn granite shaped like a hawk's head. Another marked their tools with a vertical slash cut neatly with a copper blade. At night, conversations drifted from the day's work to memories of home. Though no letters were sent or received, the workers were illiterate, and the administration did not provide for correspondence. Stories acted as preservation. Men spoke of harvests, of childhood games, of lost brothers, of mothers left behind. These fragments of speech formed bridges back to identity, a reminder that they were more than units on a tally board. Despite everything, the heat, the lash, the crushing weight of stone, many workers returned for multiple building seasons. Some volunteered rather than face another poor flood year in their village. Others found stability in the city that the pyramid had built. Regular food, shelter, a purpose, however brutal. For Setkar and others, the brotherhood that emerged was not just survival, it was memory, made communal. Their names might never be carved into limestone, but they lived in each other's voices and scars. In an empire where legacy belonged to kings and gods, this quiet fraternity stood outside of the scrolls. It left no tomb inscriptions, no official titles, but it moved the blocks, it sang the chants, and it buried the dead. It was the human thread binding the bones of the monument. During the height of the inundation season, when the Nile's water rose and submerged the fields in the valley below, the Giza Plateau remained dry, a sanctuary of stone and dust. But with the arrival of the flood also came the greatest vulnerability of any labour camp: disease. In the 4th month of Setkar's building season, the sickness began to spread. It started without alarm, a few men coughing in the barracks, a fever here or there, the occasional absence from shift duty. But within a week, entire crews began to show signs of affliction. Bodies ached, eyes reddened, skin flushed with heat. The camp healers, overwhelmed and undersupplied, diagnosed it as seasonal fever, worsened by heat, proximity and the stress of labour. The Giza workforce had swelled during this period, as it always did. During the flood season, when farming was impossible, villagers sent more conscripts. The population of the worker city surged beyond its planned capacity, perhaps over 15,000, and the sanitation systems, already strained, began to fail. Waste pipes filled quickly. Water jars became communal. Disease found its path. The symptoms were unmistakable: a dry cough, followed by shortness of breath, fever, vomiting, and in many cases, death within 3 to 5 days. The worst cases developed boils and open sores, visible signs that marked the afflicted for isolation. Later generations of scholars and archaeologists would debate the exact nature of this illness. Some have speculated it was an early form of typhoid or viral pneumonia, exacerbated by the intense crowding and poor hygiene of a mega project under pressure. Whatever its medical classification, to those who lived through it, it was simply called the Red Wind. At first, the administration attempted containment. Barracks suspected of harbouring the infected were cordoned off. A ring of reed barriers was placed around affected quarters, and guards posted to prevent unauthorised movement. Rations were delivered by cart and left at the perimeter. Anyone attempting to flee was beaten back. But containment proved impossible. The shared kitchens, the communal beer vats, and the stone ramps themselves had already carried the sickness far beyond the sealed zones. Within days, the fever reached every tier of the labour site, from the haulers to the stone cutters, from scribes to the copper tool workshops. Setkar's barracks lost 3 men in 2 days. One, a stone dust-covered hauler named Hanu, collapsed during the ascent of a mid-tier ramp and was carried down by his crew. By the time they reached the medical hut, he was unconscious. He had died by sundown. His body was wrapped in matting and buried hastily at the southern edge of the plateau, near a slope later used for surplus gravel dumping. The workforce continued, but its pace slowed. Crews rotated more frequently and teams were merged as others dwindled in numbers. Setkar's crew, once 37 strong, fell to 25, then 21. The rhythm of work chants weakened. The sound of the lash was less frequent, not out of mercy, but because there were fewer healthy backs left to strike. Simple treatments, honey dressings, Emma beer infusions did little to ease the progression of the fever. A few recovered. Most did not. The dead were removed before sunrise, often buried without identification. Some were burned, a rare and desperate measure in a culture that honoured burial as sacred. Despite the losses, the pyramid did not stop. Rations were doubled in unaffected barracks, and promises of early rotation home were issued to crews that maintained performance. New workers were brought in from the canal boat stations. The administration treated the crisis not as a spiritual calamity, but as a logistical failure to be corrected. More water was diverted to the kitchens, waste pits were expanded, lime was scattered near the barracks, yet the moral of the workforce sagged. The familiar rhythm of labour gave way to a deeper sense of dread. Each morning crews looked to see who had not risen from the straw. Faces became gaunt. Conversations dwindled. Chants grew quieter. Setkar, like many others, turned inward. Silence replaced song. Each day he watched the ramp, the faces of his remaining crew, the mounds of earth growing near the burial trench. Among the dead was a stone mason who had once shared dates with him. Another was a boy from Setkar's own district, recognised only by the copper amulet he still wore when his body was removed. The plague season reached its height after 3 weeks. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fever abated. Whether it burned itself out, lost fuel among the already afflicted, or simply mutated to a less lethal form, none could say. What remained was a workforce reduced in number, physically weaker, but still bound by duty, or necessity, to continue. New crews arrived to replace the lost. Barracks were swept, sprayed with incense and declared purified by temple scribes brought from Memphis. The work resumed at full speed, but not all scars healed. In the aftermath, foremen quietly reassigned duties to those who had survived, sometimes promoting older workers to leadership roles simply because they remained. Setkar, having endured both the fever and the worst of the hauling season, was made second in command of his own crew. His hands were no stronger than before, but he had outlasted the sickness, and that alone was seen as proof of endurance. The workers' city gradually returned to its routine. The ovens once again churned out thousands of loaves daily. Beer vats bubbled with fermentation. The ramps echoed with shouted commands and the drag of sledges. But the brotherhoods once held together by ritual and shared song carried new weight. Every team bore absences, empty sleeping spaces, silenced voices, tools no longer used. In quiet moments, some men scratched small markings into the barrack walls. A line, a circle, a symbol of a name never written in hieroglyphs. There would be no official record of the fever. No monument, no stela, no papyrus decree. Pharaoh's tomb would remain the priority. But beneath the monument's white limestone, buried under layers of stone and silence, the dead of the plague season became part of its foundation, unmarked but ever present. By the 8th month of the work cycle, the stone ramp at Giza had grown steeper, the air drier, and the tempers of the workers thinner. Though the fever had passed, its memory lingered, not just in scars and empty sleeping mats, but in a new, quieter mood that settled across the workers' city. It was not open disobedience, it was weariness made sharp. Setkar's crew, like many others, had endured the worst of the plague season and returned to near full strength, supplemented by new conscripts from the southern gnomes. But their days now unfolded into a muted rhythm. The chants still sounded along the ramps, but less often. Orders were followed, but with slower response. Eyes glanced more frequently toward the overseers. The air had shifted. In some of the peripheral crews, particularly among the gravel haulers and the sand compacting teams, rumours had begun to circulate. They were whispered at night, passed between barracks and tool yards. Stories of missing rations or unpaid families, of sick workers abandoned in the pits. Some said the grain storage had been quietly diverted to royal festivals. Others claimed that inspectors from the Pharaoh's household were falsifying tallies to hide delays. None of these accusations were written down. None were shouted aloud, but the whispers spread. The state had prepared for many crises: logical shortages, medical outbreaks, violent storms. But it had not prepared for organised discontent. Labourers were not slaves, but they were not citizens either. They served, they suffered, and they were rotated. The system relied on momentum, not consent. Yet in the weeks following the sickness, the momentum began to slip. Setkar first noticed the change in the quarry yard. A shipment of limestone was delayed for 2 days, and when it arrived, it was under-escorted. No overseer had accompanied the delivery. The team assigned to unload the sledges simply walked away, citing fatigue. No punishment was issued. The foreman did not report in. It was passed over. A quiet warning. In the workers' city, food queues lengthened. Rations were reduced without explanation. Beer, once thick and filling, arrived watered down. Fights broke out more frequently between men of different crews. The guards assigned to the kitchen doubled in numbers. At the base of the ramp, a new post was constructed. Not a storage shed, but a small guardhouse. Inside, men carried sticks, not chisels. Still the work continued. The pyramid itself rose layer by layer. Crews pushed sledges across platforms, ramp scaffolds were raised, and Tura casing stones were fitted at the southern face. But between the stones and the sweat, a shift was underway. A mood not of sabotage, but of resistance by delay. It took many forms. Some workers began dulling their tools intentionally, forcing replacements and slowing production. Others placed blocks at slight angles, causing remeasurement and recutting by the masons. Stone dust was swept into storage jars, clogging the grain used for bread. A small group of workers redirected water from the mud ramps, increasing friction and damaging the sledges. Each act was minor. Each was deniable. But together they slowed construction by measurable degrees. Foremen noticed. Overseers responded. Punishments increased. Rations were threatened. 2 workers were flogged for tampering with a stone mould. A third was arrested for inciting disobedience, though no one ever confirmed what he said. He was not seen again. But with each lash, the undercurrent of resistance deepened. It was not led by ideology or slogans. It was driven by exhaustion, by a growing realization that the lives sacrificed for the pyramid were not being counted. Some crews began to hold night vigils, not sanctioned prayers to Ra or Osiris, but whispered ceremonies honouring lost comrades. Names were spoken quietly over clay lamps. Bits of bread and beer were left at the edges of the barracks. These small rites, unofficial and unsupervised, spread from crew to crew. On one of the outer walls of a sledge house, a worker scratched a line of hieratic script into the plaster. I built the tomb of eternity, but who builds for me? The message was erased by morning, but others soon appeared, messages of grief, frustration, and remembrance. They were not protests, they were traces, proof that the men behind the monument still saw themselves as human. Setkar himself, now second in command of his crew, faced a difficult line. He was trusted by the foreman but respected by the haulers. He enforced discipline but only when necessary. He ignored minor delays but ensured safety. He knew who had poured sand into the tool vat. He said nothing. One evening, a representative from the Royal Architect's office arrived at the workers' city with scribes and guards. It was said that Pharaoh Khufu had grown dissatisfied with the pace of the upper ramp construction. Orders were delivered to reduce shift rest periods and increase stone delivery rates by 10% over the next month. The announcement was made in the central square. No one shouted in response, but no one bowed either. That night in the barracks of Ramp 9, no one slept. The men sat in silence. A clay tablet was passed between them and each one carved a mark into its surface. Not their names, but a symbol, a line, a shape. It was an oath of endurance, not against Pharaoh, but for each other. No rebellion followed. No tools were dropped en masse. No overseers were attacked. Instead, the next morning, every man returned to the ramp. But the chants were slower. The stones moved in silence. The lines were tighter, the eyes sharper. This was not the rebellion of fire and blades. It was the rebellion of memory, a rebellion of names carried in the dust, and it would continue unnoticed all the way to the capstone. The air on the Giza plateau was still the morning Pharaoh Khufu arrived, not from reverence but preparation. Word of the royal visit had reached the workers' city 3 days earlier, carried by boat from Memphis, with a contingent of scribes and security officers. Work was immediately redirected. Barracks were scrubbed, tools polished, ramps cleared, sledge crews reassigned to decorative hauling. Even the kitchens were ordered to bake fresh bread in double quantity, not for the workers, but for the priests and courtiers expected to accompany the king. No one questioned the purpose. The pharaoh's presence at the pyramid, rare and symbolic, served one function: to affirm divine order. His visit was not to see the labour, it was to see his vision realised. In preparation, foremen selected the strongest, healthiest and most obedient men to represent each crew. These workers were removed from regular duty and given clean kilts, new ropes and oiled sandals. Setkar's team, one of the oldest and most reliable on Ramp 9, was chosen to lead the ceremonial hauling. Their task: to pull a polished casing stone part way up the southern ramp and hold position while the royal procession passed. The stone itself had been specifically prepared, carved from white Tura limestone and rubbed with sand until its surface gleamed. It would not be placed into the pyramid that day. It was for show, a symbol of progress. For the labourers, it was heavier than most, its edges finely cut, offering less grip. 24 men were assigned to its movement with strict orders to avoid damage or delay. On the day of the visit, the site was transformed. Guards patrolled every entrance. Canopies were erected to shield officials from the sun. Scribes and priests stood on raised platforms near the base of the pyramid, where a temporary altar had been built. Incense burned in bronze bowls. Offerings of wine and grain were arranged in front of a carved image of Horus, the sky god, guardian of kingship. Then, as the sun passed its morning peak, the royal barge was spotted on the river below. The signal horn blew and the sight fell silent. Pharaoh Khufu arrived at Giza, seated in a litter of cedar wood, carried by 12 attendants in matching white linen. He wore his royal kilt and a golden collar adorned with lapis lazuli and carnelian. His eyes were dark, unreadable. Around him gathered high priests, court officials and royal architects. The procession moved slowly towards the base of the pyramid, flanked by soldiers and trumpeters. As it passed the workers' city, the labourers stood in organised rows, silent, heads bowed, tools at their feet. No sound was permitted. No movement beyond what was rehearsed. The Pharaoh's gaze passed over the men without pause. At the ramp, Setkar and his crew took their places. Each man held a rope. Foreman barked commands. The polished casing stone began to move. They hauled it 30 cubits before stopping at the marked point. There they stood motionless as the royal entourage approached the platform. Khufu said nothing. A priest stepped forward and intoned a blessing. A scribe read aloud a statement praising the progress of the king's eternal house. A bull was sacrificed on the altar. Blood pooled in a carved stone basin and was carried away. The pharaoh turned his eyes upwards towards the rising pyramid. He remained silent for a moment. Then he nodded once. The procession turned, retracing its path to the river, where the royal barge waited. Within minutes the pharaoh was gone. No worker was addressed. No builder was acknowledged. The stone was left half-hauled on the ramp. It would be moved later. As the guards cleared the ceremonial site, the workers returned to their post. Sandals were dirtied again. Tools resumed their rhythm. The chants rose, slower than before. Among the labourers, no one spoke of Pharaoh's silence. They had not expected gratitude, but the indifference was complete. The monument that bore his name had no room for theirs. In the following days, the ramp was reinforced. More blocks were placed. Overseers reported renewed focus. The Pharaoh's visit was recorded in official scrolls as a divine inspection. The priests declared the king pleased. The scribes wrote that the gods had smiled upon the construction. No record mentioned the men who pulled the stone. No stela carved their names into permanence. But among the crews the moment had been seared into memory, not for what was seen, but for what was not said. After the visit, a mason carved a crude figure into the side of an unused stone, a man bent beneath a block with a crown on his back. It was scratched away within a day. Another crew left a loaf of bread on the ramp, broken into 7 pieces. It was gone by nightfall. Setkar's crew returned to full duty. The pace did not quicken. The mountain of stone continued to rise, indifferent and eternal. In time the king's visit became a rumour, then a story, then a myth. Some said he had smiled. Others claimed he had cursed a cracked block. The truth faded, as it always did. What remained was the silence and the work. The pyramid stood long after Setkar was gone. It rose above the desert as the last light of the old kingdom, its perfect geometry casting shadows across centuries. Sand buried its ramps. Wind stripped away its smooth casing stones. Its capstone vanished. Its builders died unnamed. But it remained. Setkar served at Giza for 7 building seasons, longer than most men endured. When he was finally rotated home, his body bore the marks of the pyramid, joints thickened by labour, shoulders notched by rope, feet hardened by stone. His hair had gone grey, not from age, but from heat and grief. He returned to Menat a changed man. The village had not waited for him. His father had died 2 summers earlier. The fields, long unattended, had passed to cousins. Setkar was no longer a son of the Nile. He was a man of stone, and the stone had no home. For a time he found work in local quarries, shaping bricks for canal walls. His hands retained their precision. His voice, once worn down by chance, became that of a silent teacher. Young men watched his movements, learned how to balance a chisel, how to judge a fault line in limestone. He never told them what he had done at Giza. He didn't need to. His posture spoke for him. He lived modestly. He had no tomb carved in his name, no scribe to record his years. When he died, his body was wrapped in linen, buried in soft earth beneath a palm grove. A small stone was placed near the grave, marked only with a single horizontal line, the symbol of earth and of rest. The pyramid he helped build outlived every dynasty. Empires fell and rose again and again. Kings with new names claimed it. Foreigners measured it, looted it, theorized about it. Some called it a celestial observatory. Others said it was the work of lost civilizations. Few imagined the truth, that it was built by ordinary men, one stone at a time. Centuries passed before the workers' city was rediscovered. Beneath layers of sand, archaeologists found the outlines of barracks, bakeries, and tool workshops. They unearthed the bones of labourers, men with worn joints and healed fractures. They found copper chisels, bits of woven sandals, beer jars and carved game pieces. In a trash pit, they found a piece of limestone marked with dozens of small scratches, not hieroglyphs, but symbols. Some were stars, some were hands, one a bent back beneath a block. No names were inscribed, but the story was clear. The pyramid had not been built by slaves in chains, nor by gods in chariots of light. It had been built by men like Setkar, conscripted farmers, trained artisans, stubborn labourers. They had no choice but to serve, but in their service they had created the most enduring monument of human will. Their lives were short. Their voices were not recorded, but their hands touched every stone. And though they left no scrolls or statues, they built something more permanent, the foundation of memory. Every layer of the pyramid is a record of their breath, their injuries, their unyielding rhythm. Setkar's story is not unique. It is the story of tens of thousands. His was not a name for the priests to chant, but it lives in the dust between the blocks, in the slight curves of imperfect chisels, in the fragment of tools buried beneath the slope, in the silent alignment of men who worked not for glory, but because they were told to build. What remains of them is not fame, but evidence, and that perhaps is the truest kind of legacy, not one carved into gold, but one etched into stone by labour and endurance. The great pyramid of Giza still stands, weathered but unbowed, watching the desert in silence. It is the tomb of a king and the graveyard of forgotten thousands. Thank you for coming on this journey with me tonight. I truly hope you go on to have a wonderful night's sleep and restful dreams. If you enjoyed this story, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, and maybe even comment on other places you would like to visit, and I'll try and make it happen. But for now, settle down, relax, close your eyes, and drift off. May sound sleep and beautiful dreams come to you tonight, my friend. You deserve it.